And I said that's before we started all the questions on the live set, because a lot of people will say, oh, we'll ask on the live session. So we will, people are just starting to come in now. So we'll let everybody get comfy, get settled on this lovely sunny Monday morning.
Not where I'm not.
Oh, it's always sunny in Barnsley, Paul.
Yeah.
God's own country up here.
It is, yeah.
So we'll just give everyone a couple of seconds and then we'll get going, because we have got so many things to get through on this session. It is going to be a great session. Lots and lots of questions that we've been asked as people have been registering. But I also know as well on our sessions, they are very lively, and we do like the questions to come in while people are watching. So if you have a question, if you just down at the bottom, you'll see the Q&A. So if you've got a question that you want to ask of either Paul or Andy, while we're on the session today, just drop it in there and I will ask the questions. So, so people are still coming in. So just a couple of seconds longer just to give people a chance to take a seat.
Cup of tea.
Okie doke. So, can we see you, Andy? You seem to be black. Oh, there you are.
I'm not quite sure why. Yeah, I'm definitely here. I've even opened the blinds, so I've got the sun flowing in on my golden locks.
I was going to say, exactly. We don't want to not see you, do we?
Oh, dear.
Right.
That's not chuckling from you, Mr. Froese.
Well, at least you've got locks to have golden sunshine.
Right then, let's get going, and then people can join us as they join us. So, good morning, everybody, and welcome again to another Lender Spotlight. And we're joined again by Zephyr Homeloans, back by popular demand. We have had so many questions and so many requests for Zephyr to expand a little bit on their criteria and what they do differently in the market. So, I'm joined today by Paul Fryer, who's the managing director. Good morning, Paul.
Good morning, Nicola.
And also Andy Rowe, who's the business development manager for Zephyr as well. Good morning, Andy. You all right?
Morning. Yeah, very good. Thank you.
So we're going to start off today. I mean, as you know, at Knowledge Bank, we're all about adding value to what you do as brokers, because it's such a big job. And, you know, if you think about what you cover, CMAP is what you're studying there is a tiny part of it. But if you think about all the areas that you get involved in with as a broker and counselling your clients. So I'm going to hand over to Paul now, who's going to discuss in detail a case study about dealing with disputes at the end of a scheme with regards to tenants' deposits. And this will really add some value to the conversations that you have with your clients, because they'll not be having these conversations with anybody else. And this is a really, really great case, isn't it, Paul? I tell you what, Judge Binder's got nothing on this one. I'm going to hand it over. This is brilliant.
Yeah.
Brilliant.
Right, thank you, Nicola, thank you. And yeah, afternoon, everybody. It is afternoon, actually, isn't it? And the sun is just starting to come through in North Yorkshire, actually, Nicola. So it's not just Barnsley where the sun shines. There you go. Yeah, hi, everybody. So I'm Paul Fryers. I'm MD of Zephyr, and some of you may have joined a previous session that we did where I mentioned that within our broader business, being part of Computer Share Loan Services, we also run the Deposit Protection Service for the UK government. And that business effectively looks after 1.8 million tenant deposits at a point in time. And from that, we can start to draw some good data and understanding of what's happening in the private rental sector more generally, of which obviously mortgages are a parallel to that, or within the private rental sector, I should probably say. We've got about 130 people running that business. And as Nicola alluded to, we do get involved in disputes at the end of a tenancy, and we just thought it might help from a general education point of view, just to run through a case study that we've pulled together. We get quite a lot of inquiries around first-time landlords wanting mortgages, and I think just some of the stuff on these following slides will just sort of help to call out the need to get evidence properly nailed down at the start of a tenancy to avoid issues at the back end. Clearly, a good letting agent would obviously help on that. So I'm just going to share my screen now. And then we'll go into our little quiz, Nicola, which hopefully let me know when you can see this. Hopefully you can see that, if technology is working. Can you see that, Andy?
Not yet, no.
Okay. Just try again. Bear with us, people. Hopefully the tech will hold up. Here it comes. Yeah, I think it should come through now.
Yeah, got it.
There we go. Okay, right. Okay, fine. So this is a case of be the adjudicator. So this is the type of stuff that we are doing in the day job. We handle about 15,000 of these a year. So it's obviously something which happens quite frequently. So what we've got here is we've got a situation where, I'll just get into the first slide, where at the end of a tenancy after a couple of years, landlord was claiming really £450 from the deposit that the tenant had given to our scheme for returfing a lawn, because basically at the end of this particular tenancy, the grass, it's a real life case studies, this as well, these are all real, that the grass was in such a bad way that the landlord had to go and pay £450 to actually get the lawn regrassed. The tenant disputed that claim, and then our people get presented with a statement one way or the other, and we have to then come up with an adjudication as to what we're going to do. So that was the basis of the dispute. The tenant basically indicated that this was all caused by extreme weather, not me, Gov. This is all act of God stuff, hot summer, freezing weather conditions and such like. And, you know, it wasn't caused by me, so it's over to you, Mr. Landlord, to basically put this damage right before you can then re-let the property. That then gets compared with a statement from the landlord, who in our case here would potentially be the customer of our guys on the phone on this session. And his view or her view was that the garden was in a great condition at the start, but by the end of it, there was no grass, just mud and animal straw. So this is where the plot thickens, Nicola. And we end up with some sort of issue around 14 rabbits in the garden. And it is a real life scenario, is this? And the landlord actually procured a statement from the neighbour as well. So that is a lot of rabbit, and I can only imagine that they did cause a lot of issue. So the tenant ruined the lawn. So, you know, how do we deal with that? So we then receive all that information, and we then have to look at the evidence provided. And that evidence kind of runs through the tenancy agreement itself, where there's an agreement between the tenant and landlord that the property generally, and in this case, that includes the garden, should come back in the same condition as when let. And that there is an inventory as well. So there's a very clear document that the tenant signs that says that generally the garden was in good condition. We're then presented with dated photographs at the start and at the end of the tenancy. And we also get the email statement from the neighbour about the fact that there's 14 rabbits in the garden. An invoice or an estimate for the work to be undertaken. And there's also an email statement from a gardener who was sort of propping up the claim of the tenant. So we get presented with all that good stuff, and then we then get asked to go and make a decision. So in this one, Nicola, where would you go? Would you go split decision, landlord or tenant? I'll put you on the spot there, shall I? In an interactive way.
That is a difficult one, because you see, I'm going to have to sit on the fence, and I'm going to have to say split decision. But the reason I say that is because you're thinking, well, how can you know, is it somebody's word against somebody else's? And of course, you know, you're trying to make a decision without seeing these. I don't know if there's photographic evidence of the bunnies, or I don't know.
Who knows?
I'm going to go split decision.
Well, we'll go for that, shall we? And it's incorrect. Okay. So yeah, so we can go again, and in the interest of time, I'm going to click on landlord, simply because I know the outcome here, because I know we've got a lot of questions to answer about criteria. And landlord is the actual outcome on this one. And the reason why is effectively down to the documentation, actually getting the proof. So this goes back to at the start of the tenancy, really giving your customer a nudge, if your customer is the landlord, you know, to really make sure that they've got good evidence as to what the state of the property was at the outset of the tenancy with a good inventory. As I say, a letting agent would very likely do all this anyway, but obviously not everybody uses a letting agent. And, whilst the tenant provided a statement from a gardener, that gardener didn't visit the property and all this type of stuff. So basically the weight of evidence came down on the side of the landlord in this particular instance. It doesn't always work that way, but that's the way it worked out on this one. And it just comes back to making sure there's real good evidence, photographs, signed off lists between both landlord and tenant as to the state of the property at outset that can then be compared to the state of the property when given back. And basically that's all, about trying to avoid disputes at the end. So hopefully that's just a bit of insight there to, how things actually can work between landlord and tenant, and, potentially help, the people on the session today to add a bit of value into the conversations with their customers. So here endeth the lesson, I think, is the piece there.
That's really, thank you for that, Paul, because that's just such a good example, isn't it, of where, and as you say, you would hope that they're getting some good advice from their letting agent, but there are a lot of landlords that don't necessarily use letting agents, and it's if they, where else are they going for this advice? But it's such a simple thing to make sure you've got an inventory, photographic evidence, you sort of dual signing the inventory to make sure everyone's in agreement up front, because that's the kind of thing that you wish you'd have done when something goes wrong at the back end, isn't it?
It is, yeah. And as I say, we're dealing with, there's 1.8 million deposits that we look after, and we deal with about 15,000 of these a year. So, by comparison to the whole pool, it's actually a very small percentage, but nonetheless, it's a significant number. So it does kind of call out the fact that it does crop up a lot. Disputes do happen a lot. And therefore, just, giving everybody a protected position, whether they are landlord or tenant, it's just important to get that documentary evidence together before the tenancy commences. Otherwise, it can become difficult at the end. On our website, on the DPS website, which we can happily share with anybody who wants to have a look at it, there's a whole range of different case studies, all based on real life examples, involving kitchens, bathrooms, you name it. We come across the whole shebang, basically. All of which generally point towards get the documented evidence as to what the state of the property is at the start and at the end. So yeah, hopefully that's just a little bit of different insight, Nicola.
No, that's brilliant. Thank you very much for that, Paul. I'm sure the advisors on this session will have found that really insightful and helpful to just have that better quality conversation and just something a little bit different to what other people are doing as well. So that's great. Oh, we just have one quick question on that, actually, Paul. I'm just going to say this. So Suntox just asked, can landlords hold on to the deposit for several months after the tenant has moved out?
Well, the deposit is actually held on, is actually put into a scheme. So the scheme that we run is the largest custodial scheme. So that means that we actually hold the tenant deposit. There are insured schemes, but we don't actually play in that space. So at the start of the tenancy, that deposit is not held by the landlord. It's actually held by a scheme like us. Which was basically a government-sponsored initiative a good number of years ago now, to basically provide some structure, some governance, some formality around how tenant deposits are dealt with, and also how then adjudications are taken care of at the end of the tenancy. So the simple answer is no. It has to be dealt with by a scheme, and that scheme then has to sign up to a range of principles with the MHCLG, Ministry of Homes, Communities, Local Government, as to how we then deal with adjudications like this. So, yeah.
Brilliant. Thanks for that, Suntox. That's a good question. And I'm going to move over to criteria now, Paul, because Andy is chomping at the bit to go on this, and we've got loads and loads of questions to go at. So I'm going to run through some questions that people have asked on registration. But equally, if you have any questions, you see down at the bottom, there's a little Q&A button. So if you want to type your question in there, and Andy or Paul is happy to answer as we go on. So we are talking multi-unit freehold blocks and flats and everything in between, aren't we, Andy, today? And we are. So much to get through. I'm going to kick off with an interesting question, because we've got people on here, we've got advisors who have got a massive range of experience and skill sets. So just to start with a really sort of grassroots question. Simon's asked, what's the difference between an MUFB and an HMO?
Good question. Very, very good question. So a multi-unit, let's start with an MUFB, a multi-unit freehold block. what that basically entails is a selection of flats sitting on one title. So many of the advisors on the call today will know that, generally speaking, when you come across a flat, it's on a long lease. There's a freehold at the bottom of the building, and then each of the flats within that building is on a long lease of 75 years, 100 years, 999 years, whatever it happens to be. But every so often you'll come across a block where leases haven't been created and all of those flats sit on the title at the bottom. So that's a multi-unit freehold block, okay? An HMO is basically the definition of who's living in a particular property. So in simple terms, you can break it down into three categories: C3, C4, and sui generis. C3 is classed as a dwelling house, and it can be up to 6 related parties living in a house. C4, or an HMO, is up to 6 unrelated parties. So definition of an HMO, Nicola, is 3 or more people from 2 or more families living in a property. And with a C4, you can go up to 6 people in that property. Sui generis is for 7 and above of its own type, in effect. But it's where you have multiple people living in a property under potentially one tenancy agreement, or they may have several tenancy agreements. So you could have 4 tenancies covering 4 individuals within that property. You can, in actual fact, have a multi-unit freehold block where one of the flats within that block could be rented as an HMO. So you can get crossover.
Oh, okay, that is it, because we've just had another question as well. Ashley wants to know: can a multi-unit freehold block be sold up as separate units?
Can be what? Sorry.
Can an MUFB be sold off as separate units?
It can, but it presents difficulties. So if we take our policy, if we're lending on a multi-unit freehold block, we want the whole block. We call it carve off. There's various names, broken freehold, whatever. It's where a landlord has taken one of the properties within that block, put it on a long lease and sold it, but then retained the rest of the block on the freehold title. That presents difficulties to us as a lender. We wouldn't lend in that scenario. We want the whole block. So, it's not for me to give landlords advice on how to run their properties, but I think a lot of lenders would probably find it easier if all the flats were then split onto long leases and we could each take an individual charge on a flat within that block, because it does present difficulties to lenders.
No, that's right. And then just one other question, just to provide some context and background, just where brokers are just really curious. I love this question. Steve asks, are houses considered as multi-unit freehold blocks if there are 2 houses on one plot, or are they always flats?
Oh, great question. Great question. Yeah, well, actually, yes, they are in effect, because it's a multi-unit, or it's multiple units on one freehold title. And actually, it's a really great question, because I get these kind of inquiries all the time where it's 2 in fact, I had one last week, 2 semi-detached houses sitting on one title. And the broker's like, I'm really struggling to place it. And I said, you are going to struggle to place it, but let me tell you why. So the difficulty that we find as lenders is getting comparable valuations. So any valuer that's looking to provide us with a valuation is always looking to support that valuation with local evidence. And the difficulty where you've got multiple properties on one title is finding those comparable properties to compare against. So it's a really difficult position. And whilst we would accept it as a lender, as an application, the chances are very strong that once we get to the valuation point, we get a nil return on the valuation and the case stops dead in its tracks. So it's a tricky one, because they're definitely out there. You might get a block of flats and a house on a title. You get all sorts of weird and wonderful setups. Okay. So yeah, it absolutely can be. Yeah.
I think you might have just answered Michael's question there. Michael's just gone into the Q&A, and Michael wants to know, so multi-unit, combination of houses and flats, and so are they allowed? Is that what you would class as an MUFB, houses and flats? And Michael's just stolen my next question, but I'm going to let him have this one, because the next question I was going to ask you is, what are the maximum number of units allowed?
So for Zephyr, it's 6. We've got up to 6 units on one title. Clearly, you'll get blocks up to 20, 30, whatever. But for us, it's a maximum of 6 on one title. And the reason for that is because with our valuation partners, we are looking for a bricks and mortar valuation, not an investment back valuation. And what you tend to find on larger blocks is the valuations are provided are investment back, which we don't accept. So yeah, it's up to 6 for us.
Okay, that's great. And actually, we're just sort of establishing what's classed as an MUFB. So David's just asked the question: Where do granny annexes sit if they have separate council tax bills? So are we talking, so does it matter about the council tax bill, or are you looking particularly at the title deed when you're deciding if it's an MUFB?
Oh, blimey, these are good questions, aren't they? So granny annexes are you again, you see a lot of this, and it's, you know, are they attached within the main house? So, you know, are they a detached granny annex? Is it attached within the main house? So there's an entrance between the main building and the annex. That creates problems. Is it on its separate title deed? Does it have its own services? So I think the simple way to shut this one down in terms of what we're looking for specifically as lenders is there's two key elements that we look for on a multi-unit freehold block. And I'll just point this out because we very often get inquiries where, for instance, and slightly off topic, but it will pick up the theme. You may get a typical sort of London townhouse or an inner city townhouse that's been converted into 3 flats, okay? And they're sitting on the title at the bottom. So it's been converted into a multi-unit freehold block. So what we're looking for specifically is, one, that each of the properties has a lockable entrance that you don't access through one of the other properties. So that's the first thing we look at. The second thing we look at is that each of the properties must have their own utilities actually directly into the property. So again, I had last week, very topical, I had a guy phone me up. It was 3 flats on one title. There's one set of services going into the building, but then what he'd done is he'd put a coin meter into each property. Would that be acceptable? Another good case study. Would we do it? Wouldn't we do it? We won't do it because the services, it's just one set of utilities going in. So same with the granny annex. If it's a granny annex, the 2 problems you've got is, does it have separate services? Is it accessed through the main building? And has it got its own lockable entrance? And the other problem there, of course, is getting that comparable valuation again, because you've got a house with an annex and trying to find something that matches it is difficult. So whilst they're within policy, they're very, very difficult to get over the line.
No. Well, you just mentioned valuations there, and that's something I want to pick up actually, Andy. So, so when we're talking about things, you know, where you've got maybe, we've had a lot of inquiries around this. So flats above commercial properties and also adjacent to. And the one thing that I know drives brokers absolutely mad is when it says it's down to valuers' comments. Now, you know it is, however, it's so difficult because when you're sat with your client and they're saying, look, is this something they'll accept? And, you know, it is down to valuers' comments, but it would be great to have some kind of steer just to understand what it is your valuers are looking for, so that realistically they can put that application and think, it is down to valuers' comments, absolutely, but I'm pretty sure that one will go through because that's the kind of appetite they've got, or something that you definitely don't like. So if you can just give us a bit of a steer on that, that would be fantastic.
Okay, so let's start this one off by saying we've lent next door to a chip shop and we've lent above the Wetherspoons. Now, I'm not saying that we want to get loads of chip shop and Wetherspoons application, but it gives you a flavour of where to start with this, okay? So I think the first thing to pick up is new builds, okay? So we give guidance to our valuers on what we're looking for as a lender. They give us guidance on what we should think about and accept as a responsible lender. With the guidance that we've had from our partners, which are Connells, is that if it's a new build property, then any commercial element underneath shouldn't adversely affect that property. So in 99.9% of cases, it's going to go through and there's not going to be an issue. Okay, so that's a good place to start. I think the problems start to crop up with commercial when it's just sort of typical London high street, and maybe there's a kebab shop, there's a nail parlor, there's a hairdresser's, there's a pizza place, there's a deli, and then there's a 24-hour all night kind of utility shop or whatever. So what's the guidance? And it is a really difficult one to give guidance on, because as BDMs, we get a flavour of what's coming to us on a daily basis and what's getting approved and what's getting declined. But all the brokers that I speak to, I try and give them the same guidance because it's what we generally see. So the first thing is the property adversely affected by noise or smell? So if you can stand in that property and you can hear the commercial that's around the property, or it's pervasive into the property from a smell perspective, then there's a very strong chance that valuer is going to return an unfavourable valuation or a nil return. because that's adversely affecting the property. And what are we actually thinking about in this scenario is our ability to resell that property in a diminished market, because people don't want to live in a smelly flat. And that's cutting to the chase here. I don't want to live in a noisy apartment. I don't want to live in a smelly flat. Those are the things that adversely affect those valuers' comments. And if you own that property already, you should probably know that, because you've been in there. If you're buying in it, that's it, or you're buying a new flat, then it's probably worth trying to figure that out. Maybe visit with the estate agent on a couple of times, go at different parts of the day, so you can try and establish what's going on, so you know as a buyer what you're getting into.
Yeah.
So that's the first thing. Second thing that can adversely affect a valuation are blue bins. Blue bins, demon bins, I like to call them. So very often you'll see, if you get like a parade of shops and flats at the back of the building, especially if it's rear access, very often if you've got food outlets and stuff, they've got these big commercial waste bins at the back. Can be potentially a pest problem, and valuers pick up on this, and they kind of view them a little bit unfavorably, and just generally messy areas to the rear of the building. And they're the kind of three key areas that we see can be really, really problematic. There's loads of scenarios we could get into, petrol stations and pubs and all this kind of stuff, and we've lent next to pubs, and some pubs we won't do because it depends on how noisy it is, and all of these things, we look at, but it's just trying to get a flavour of the environment, really.
I think, as Andy says, we have done, a fair amount of lending on this type of property, but it is a tricky one. And I think, just to some of the scenarios that Andy's talking about there, I just encourage people to pick up the phone and have a fairly detailed conversation with us as early as possible, so we can work out as best we can between us whether any of these factors are going to come to play or not. And I guess that's a bit more difficult in a COVID environment where, we're sort of working a bit more remotely, aren't we? But yeah, we have done it. The Wetherspoons one is an interesting one. That was centre of London. I think it was second floor above a Wetherspoons pub. It went through. It was a very good case, actually. And yeah, so I think early engagement on a detailed level with members of the sales team would be helpful.
And as well, just to throw my temper in, I'd probably say to brokers as well, if you don't already, just check out Google Street View, because that's a really, really good tool, isn't it? Just to see exactly what is around and how that looks. How does that differ? Andy, you did mention about London and other big cities. So how do things differ there? Do you take a different view? Because the setup in London, especially central London, where space is at a premium and things are on top of one another, do you have a little bit different criteria for London or inner cities? How does that differ?
That's actually a good question, and actually we don't. Our guidance to our valuers is standard guidance that works irrespective of where they're viewing that property. And it's actually a really good question, because one of the points brokers often argue with me is it's in a really good location. It's 2-minute walk from a tube station. It's got great access to the city and work and and all of those are really, really strong points, of course. But it still comes down to how that local commercial element is affecting that property from a resale point of view. And that's the hard fact of it, really.
Yeah, no, that's
so. Yeah,
point. I just wonder, because obviously people are a little bit more so forgiving in London. I think they're a bit more used to that. It's whereas you go out maybe further out of the cities, and if it was, if you had a fried chicken shop next door, that's a bit more unusual. But in London, because everything's so, but it's still the same criteria, isn't it? It's just whether yeah,
it is. And I think, look, this comes back to the point you raised right at the very beginning. It's valuer comments. And whilst we all work, it's the same with underwriters. We all work to a given set of instructions, but different people view things different ways. Two brokers can go to the same client and come back with a different solution on what's the most appropriate lending. Two underwriters can underwrite a case and come to a different conclusion. Same with valuers. If a valuer that's living in a residential area, or a valuer that's working in London went to a residential area, perhaps he'd sign off more than that local valuer, because he's got a different take on what sells and what doesn't. So it is difficult, and that valuer's commentary does, of course, come into it. But we try and guide our valuers as best we can on what we're looking for, and equally they try and guide us back again.
No, brilliant. Kulvinder's asked a question. On a multi-unit property, do you have a minimum valuation on flats?
We do. Good question. 100,000. So our minimum value for a standard property is 75. For HMOs and multi-units is 100, but it's the whole block not individual flats within that block. I know some lenders say it's a minimum 100,000 for each flat within the block. We're the whole block.
Right. Okay, that's great. And then we just had a question. So this is a question from Ray. He is coming on the Q&A. So do you provide buy-to-let loans to capital raise on a new build property? So it's not said whether it's a flat or a house, but new build property that has been built by the current owners who are small developers looking to retain the property for investment. The property will have a 10-year warranty.
Yes. I'm trying to think of the best way to answer this question. We will capital raise for any legal purpose, okay, up to 75% loan to value. So yes, we're going to want it with a new build. We're going to want appropriate warranties. You know, if the people that have developed the property are looking to pay off any bridging loans or finance that they've used to fund that build, then we can do that, of course. If they're then looking to capital raise additionally to buy other buy-to-lets or whatever the case may be, we can look at that. I guess the question comes down to just getting into a bit more detail, whether it's within the 6 months of completion, because we can look at that provided that they are showing on land registry as the owners, the legal owners, but we would only do it on the finished value. We wouldn't. And actually, this is crossing over slightly more into where properties are redeveloped. So you know, people buy properties at auction and they redevelop them and make them better, spend money on them. We would only work to the original purchase price or original value within the 6 months. Once the 6 months has passed, we can then look at any enhanced value, provided, of course, it's backed up by the valuer. But yes, certainly that's something we could consider.
Brilliant. I've got a question now I want to ask you, because as you know, and Knowledge Bank, we like to really get to the bottom of things, and on the lender spotlights, it's a great opportunity to lift the lid and really understand you as a lender. And David's asked the question, so just on the theme of investors, so David's asked the question, why does Zephyr, as a dedicated buy-to-let lender, decline investor-led developments?
Good question. We don't actually decline them, but we reduce our risk or our exposure within that particular building. So we've got our standard exposure rules, 1 in 4, 2 between 5 and 8, 25% of the block between 9 and 50, and 15% of the block from 51 onwards. That's our standard exposure rule on a block. However, when you see a new build development, what you tend to find is that the majority of sales that are going on within that development are investor-led. So, you know, by the very nature of what's going on, the properties will tend to be filled with tenants rather than owner occupiers. And so, you know, the potential risk there from a lender's point of view is that you have a reduced purchase market in the event of a possession event, because not everyone who potentially is going to be an owner occupier is going to want to live in a block that is filled with tenants. You know, they more likely maybe to want to live in a block that's got other owner occupiers in it. So when you see massively led investment blocks, it's just a warning out to lenders to reduce the amount of borrowing they'll do. So in our case, we will look at that block. We have a credit forum that meets, and Paul's on the credit forum, so it might be I'll add a little bit more detail here, but we have a credit forum that meets once a week. And then we'll look at that block and we'll look at the area and we'll look at what's going on with it, and we'll make a decision on what we feel that we can fund within that block.
Yeah, and I think that's right, Andy. So I think you summed it up really well. So we're often approached, well, week in, week out around some of these developments, and then we'll take a view of the brochureware on each development. We'll take that into our committee, and we'll then give a view back as to what type of exposure that we'd be happy to go to. And it tends to be, you know, a few properties, you know, rather than, you know, a significant part of a particular development. But I think that's probably typical for the type of lender that we are.
No, that's great, and thank you for that. I mean, it's great to get that kind of response from a lender to understand, you know, what you do, what you don't do, and why you don't do something. It just gives a much clearer picture. One of the things that I know that brokers are keen to understand is, so you mentioned there, Andy, we say about private ownership, and that is a really key point, isn't it? Especially when we're talking about a block of flats. You know, how much of it is investor and how much is private ownership. How can brokers find this out? Is there anything that they can access or any resource that they can use to get some kind of, you know, understanding around that before they then put an application in to a lender?
So I think there's two sides to that question. If we just go back to the new build block side of it first, we would take a view regardless that it's likely to be predominantly investor led, because a lot of new build blocks tend to be by default. So I think that would be our default position. So that clearly you're going to get examples where you may get more owner occupiers moving into that block over time, but that's the position we would take. I think on a slightly broader stroke with that question, if you're looking at ex-local authority properties, funnily enough, I was working on a portfolio on Friday that a broker's looking to put over to us, and I was just doing some research in the background. And one of the properties I noticed was an ex-local authority flat. And then when I went to check it, I found that 70% was still owned by the local authority. And our rule is 50% must be in private ownership. And I went back to the broker and told him, and he was like, oh, well, that's great, because that's just saved me keying that application and getting all the way through to valuation to find out right at the 11th hour that I've spent their fee and it's not going anywhere. So what tool do I use to do that? It's streetcheck.co.uk. I think it's a fairly well-known website that a lot of brokers can access. If you put the address of the property, and it does tend to break down the demographics of that area in terms of local authority, private investor, owner occupier, and it just gives you a bit of detail. And it's not going to absolutely nail it on for you, but it's going to get pretty close to giving you a steer on what's going on in that area.
That's brilliant. And because as you rightly said there, the last thing that a broker wants to do is spend their clients' money on a survey when you've no idea when it's going to go through or not. So to be able to find that out up front, so that's streetcheck.co.uk.
Yeah.
Brilliant, thank you for that.
And I guess thinking about what you said earlier, Nicola, about Google Street Check and whatever the Google one is called, it's kind of the theme, isn't it, around the investment of time up front with the conversation with Andy and some public source of information, which can just help to sort of gather confidence that something is going to fly, and that we're not in a position, as Andy says, where a value has been instructed and and the client's money has been spent. So yeah, perhaps that's a bit of a theme from this.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think it is important because that information is held somewhere. Valuers have got access to that, and so it's just how does that. How do you get hold of that information? Just to try and do all you can, because nobody wants to be putting an application that's not going anywhere. That's the last thing the client wants, the broker wants, or the lender, isn't it? Really, you want to target, don't you?
Indeed. Yeah. Just one other quick thought on that, Nicola, and it relates back to a previous life actually before I came to Zephyr. But we had a case from my previous lender where it was marginal, and the comments from the valuer is, we believe that more than 50% may be in private ownership, but actually the client and the broker went away and approached the local authority and got a detailed breakdown of exactly what had been sold off, and came back to us and proved that actually less than 50% was in private ownership. And we took that and then reevaluated where we were at and put it back to the valuer. So, you can go the extra mile if you need to when you're on the cusp with a case, but that's the general theme there, I think.
That's good to know. So you mentioned ex-local authority, Andy, and I'm going to pick up on that. So I want to talk everything: high-rise, lifts, deck access. Where are you at as a lender on those kinds of things?
All of it. All of it. So let's pick up. Well, yeah, deck access is, a lot of lenders don't like deck access, or balcony access as it's sometimes known as. That's absolutely fine for us. We don't have a problem. Height of block. So our kind of standard theme is we've got no height restriction on a block. However, if a block is above 10 stories, we do just want to sensor check it before you bring it to us. So the key here is just to get on the phone to myself, Elliot, or Mark, or one of the telephone BDMs, drop us over a link to the block, any photographs you have of it. We'll then pick that up with our risk team, let them have a quick look, and make sure that it's the kind of property that we want to be looking on and lending on. So we'll just have a quick look at it and be sure of that. So again, no height restriction, especially some of these new builds you see in London, going up. I think we've done 30, 40-story blocks. So, it's not a problem. It's just making sure we have that sensor check, specifically with XLA. And with lifts, we're the same as probably most lenders. If it's 4 or more stories, then we want to see a lift.
Yeah, because that's
simple kind of guidance, really.
Taking your shopping up 34 stories, is it?
Indeed.
So right, okay, I can hear, they've not asked in the Q&A, but I can hear every broker on this call screaming at me to ask about cladding. So let's talk the elephant in the room, and we are going to discuss cladding and EWS1 forms. We have now got a category on Knowledge Bank for that, by the way. So we So we've been around Ask Every Lender, so you can search on Knowledge Bank for that. But Andy, Zephyr's stance on that, and actually Catherine's asked a question. Catherine wants to know, what would you do without the relevant EWS1 form? So where are you as a lender on this?
Okay, this is a really good topic. I'm going to let Paul pick up afterwards, because I think Paul's going to add quite a lot of insight on what I do from a criteria point of view. So EWS1 form, external wall system, that's what it stands for anyone listening who's not sure what it is. So up until January last year, any block over 18 meters needed a cladding report, an EWS1 form or another kind of report. As of January last year, that rule changed, and it's any height of block now. And I'm getting challenged on a regular basis. Oh, it's over 18 meters, and the local authority is saying it's not required. It is required. Some of the local authorities haven't quite caught up yet. So that's the first point to note. I was on a call a few weeks ago with Paradigm. And they actually did a compliance piece at the end, and they did a case study on EWS1 forms, and they are actually noting that there have been episodes throughout the UK of fraudulent EWS1 forms, and they were actually talking about a case in South Wales. And I think lenders aren't shy to the fact that there have been fraudulent EWS1 forms. Our position is this: we don't accept them currently, okay? And that's it's a line in the sand. So the way that we're working currently in the market is, if our valuer, or once our valuer attends the property, they will come back to us and say, you need a cladding report on this particular property, and we are looking for a report that complies with MHCLG standards. We will actually write to the broker and tell them specifically what we're looking for, and give them the detail of what they need to then talk to the client about and go away and get. And I've had brokers saying to me, "Oh, all lenders accept EWS1 forms." No, they don't. Some do, some don't, and we're one of the don't category. And I think you've just got to get your head around the fact that this particular area of lending currently is an absolute minefield. And I know Paul's probably jumping at the bit because he's got a lot more detail on this than I have, because of the work that he does. So it is a minefield, and I'll pass over to Paul.
Yeah, I mean, I think, look, it is a really difficult subject, not to overplay it more than Andy has. So the government announced a support package a week or so ago, when Robert Jenrick announced the further funding of £3.5 billion for existing defects. So I guess that goes some way to, rectifying the problem for people in their current properties. But obviously those, people within those properties have got, are in a bit of a difficult situation, to say the least. What, as lenders, we're also waiting to see is just the outcome of a current RICS consultation, RICS consultation, which will then be a fairly critical part in, I think, then starting to come up with a more lender industry position emerging. I know that, UK finance are heavily involved in conversations with the political sector around how can we get to a place where lenders are all approaching this in a similar fashion. So I think with that announcement of last week, I think with the RICS guidance coming out to give a little bit more consistency for the valuation community, and then with further work around the fraudulent point that Andy makes, which is a significant point for lenders to be aware of. Then we may well end up with a more generic approach to this once that's all fallen into place. But it's been a problem for a while, obviously. I think progress has been made, but it's a tricky one to solve.
Yeah, it is. And I mean, I can add a little bit into that as well, because I've been involved, obviously, with Knowledge Bank, and we're on quite a lot of panels with the FCA, and I do know that this is something the FCA are looking closely at. And just before Christmas, I kicked off on a Zoom with them and talking about the issues that that brokers are finding, and that lenders are as well. And I think everybody's trying to look at it from different angles, because there was this sort of thing about 3 stories, and I think there was a situation where we got lenders sort of declining 3-story houses because they've not got any debt, and all those things, and it's just so difficult, isn't it? So yeah, that is something that I think more is going to come out this year, but it's just everybody trying to find their way. As I say, on Knowledge Bank, we have got a category. So the question you got asked, Andy, saying, "Oh, the lenders do it." We've got the answers from lenders now, so you can look on there and just see what everybody's individual stance is, and just what everybody grapples with with where we are.
Yeah, and I think there's a definite desire to come up with a solution for this. I guess the sort of scale of the problem is that, you've got lenders involved, you've got values involved, you've got the fire assessment community involved. There's such a broad range of stakeholders involved in this. And, clearly the government are wanting all those sort of different stakeholders to come together. And, I think, as you say, there'll be further developments as we move through the rest of this year. I guess the pace of those developments remains to be seen, but it's not for want of it not being, a high priority issue for the lender industry generally.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I'm just going to look back because we've just been asked a question. David's asked a question talking about the investor-led stuff. So I'm just going to look back on this to make sure we answer. David's asked, on new build flats, how long do you class these as new builds? And if the property was remortgaged to you after that time, would you still view it as investor-led?
That's a good question. It's within 12 months of initial occupancy. Okay. So if it was built 2 years ago, but it has only been occupied for 6 months, we take it from the date of occupation. So, right. Or if it's occupied immediately upon completion, we take it from the date of occupation. So it's 12 months. Okay. So the difficulty there is, that's a good question. And I don't think it's one I can answer on this call, because I'm not aware specifically of any case studies that we've had come in where this is actually cropped up. So I guess the simple answer would be, we would look at it on a case-by-case basis, and if we felt that it was predominantly investor-led, we would probably take the same view and restrict the amount that we were lending in there for that purpose. But obviously, clearly, it's a really good question, because the difficulty you've got as buildings move forward, the occupancy structure changes on not a daily basis, but relatively regularly. So, it's a difficult one to answer, but I think we take on a case by case and then review it and decide what we felt.
I think that's right. I think that's one of those cases, isn't it, where, we get approached for various cases, which are always a little bit sort of not necessarily defining policy that well. And I think that's one where we want to know a bit more about it, and then potentially it would be a credit forum type conversation, which is our internal way of looking at cases that are a little bit different, and that might fit the mould in that regard.
Brilliant. I'm just going to run through a few, because I know we're sort of 45 minutes, but I'm just going to go a little bit further, because we've got some questions on cases that brokers are trying to place. So I won't mind running a few of those through, because the criteria in those will help everybody else watching today. So just talking about occupancy, Julian has a case. He's got a multi-unit freehold block that's let to a housing association, and the tenants are adults with learning disabilities. They're the current tenants in there, but they don't have care or anyone on site. Is that something you consider?
It's not, unfortunately. It's not something we can do. So our policy for letting, so let's just talk about the relationship with the housing association, or the association, I can't remember what you call them, but the association firstly. Our position is that any AST arrangement needs to be directly between the landlord and the tenant. So we don't allow a tenancy agreement with a third party who then effectively brings tenants into the building. Okay, so that's the first thing. Same with any direct debit for rental payments need to be between the tenant and the landlord. So for instance, if you've got a DSS tenant in there, and they're getting assistance from the local authority, we can't have a scenario where the local authority are paying the landlord. The local authority needs to pay the tenant needs to pay the landlord. In terms of people with any kind of special needs at all that need support and that kind of stuff, it's a very, very difficult position. I know a lot, we wouldn't do it, and I know a lot of lenders are going to struggle with that, because obviously those tenants have need a degree of protection, and what they're doing, that without going into the specific characteristics of any particular tenant, what's their situation with signing a tenancy agreement? Do they need support in taking that action and signing an agreement? And you just get into a whole raft of potential issues as a lender with the protection of that tenant from the tenancy agreement perspective. So for us, it's quite cut and dried, in as much we want a tenant who has the capacity to sign a tenancy agreement with the landlord directly.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. So two issues there, isn't it? So it's not just the occupancy, it's the local authority thing. Because quite a lot of brokers would say to that, well, as a lender, why don't you like the rent coming directly from the local authority to the landlord, missing the tenant out? Because actually what you've got there is you've got the chance for the tenant to spend it and not pay the landlord. So as a lender, why do you prefer that extra step? Is there a legal reason, or is it just preference?
Do you want to answer this one, Paul? I see you nodding there. I don't know if you want to pick this one up. Or...
I think it probably comes down to, you know, from a funding point of view, we kind of set out our wares, if you wish, in terms of policy and such like. And as Andy says, it's about having the tenant in the property actually paying the rent directly to the landlord, which is then finds its way through a sort of a core theme of all of our sort of funding arrangements. I guess when we get into arrangements directly with local authorities, that's potentially a slightly different type of lending that we just don't play in. It's not that we wouldn't ever look at anything different like that, but it's just that, you know, I guess we've not identified a market demand for it. And, you know, to go and put something in place for, you know, an odd case where it may fit this particular mold, or it, you know, would probably, you know, from a cost benefit point of view, just wouldn't sort of surface to the top of the pile, I guess, Nicola, really. So it's a good question, but I guess, you know, we've kind of set out the stall really to get that sort of structural tenancy landlord arrangement set up, and then that's a concept that funding markets are familiar with, and you know, as long as we've got that, then we can build the business and scale up really. Rather than sort of getting to slightly different types of structures.
That makes sense. Another one we have had in from John. John has a client with a block of 45 flats over 5 stories. 45 flats, 5 stories, a ground floor flat, and underground parking. Where are you at with that? Especially on the underground parking, because that we've not been asked that one before. That's an interesting one because of the potential fire risk and that kind of thing.
Yeah, it's a great question, because actually there's nothing in our policy that picks this particular point up. But actually, we had some of these questions coming beforehand, and I thought, oh, that's a great question. So I had a little chat with our head of risk on Friday. I said, good one, this is not something you see very often. What's our view? And the simple answer is that we're absolutely fine with it. If that parking arrangement is part of that block, the block has been built appropriately, which obviously I guess goes goes within reason that it's going to be built properly, then we don't have a problem with it. And, you know, very often you'll see blocks that have underground parking, and part of that parking is attributed to a particular property within it. In terms of the 45 properties within the block, again, going back to our exposure rule, it's not a new build. We can potentially lend up to 25% of that block up to 50. So we could potentially do 25% of that block. But it might be a good point to touch on something that is particularly dear to our hearts and comes up on a regular basis, and that is relationships between freeholders and leaseholders, because it's a really complex issue. And I think we are seeing many lenders change their perspective on how they view this because of the potential complications between a leaseholder and a freeholder, and how that arrangement could potentially antagonize our charge. So for us, if a leaseholder has a relationship with the freehold that is within keeping with the building, so to explain that in English, let's say you've got 10 properties in that block and they own 10% of the freehold along with each other leaseholder, then that's absolutely fine. Or if they have no relationship to the freehold at all, that's absolutely fine. It's where that relationship is greater than the relationship of the property to the block. So going back to that scenario, let's say that they own 1 flat in that 10, but they own 15 or 20 or 25% of the freehold. That's where we potentially got an issue. So what we're looking for in that scenario is not only an all monies charge on the actual leasehold property, but we're also additionally looking for a comfort charge on the freehold. And this is where we can potentially trip up on occasion, because we need the freeholder and the leaseholder to be the same legal entity. Now, there's a whole raft of different ways of doing this, and different lenders approach it in different ways. Some lenders don't have that arrangement, or some lenders like the freehold to be in a separate legal entity, so a limited company or whatever. For us, if that relationship is to the point where it's unusual, we want a charge, and it's got to be the same legal entity. So whether that legal entity is an SPV or that legal entity is the individual that owns the leasehold and the freehold, that's where we would want the charge.
Brilliant. Okay. That's right. Like you say, that's exactly. It's quite a complex thing, isn't it? But
it is.
That is the key, isn't it?
I'll give you a really quick case study. It's a few years old now, but the case study is that a wife owned the leasehold property and the husband owned the freehold. The wife then didn't pay service charges and ground rent to the husband, who then aggravated the lender's charge on the leasehold property because of his relationship between the freehold and the leasehold. And his charge moved ahead of the lender's charge and created an issue. And I think the thing that we see as a lender, because I'm not sure how many people watching this today will be aware, but we manage a massive, I don't know, Paul's talked about this on previous discussions we've had, but we manage a massive back book over at Computershare, who is our parent company through our Topaz brand. So we have so much history and knowledge of lending across so many different property types, and we see some of these difficulties that can crop up between leasehold, freehold connections. And our policy has been developed as a consequence of the knowledge that we have. So it is a really complex area, and it's getting more and more complicated, I think, as time moves forward, and more lenders are changing their perspective on how they view these things.
But it's a great and a unique position for you to be in as a lender, isn't it? Because you've almost got that foresight. You can see what's going on in real time. So
yeah, exactly.
People perhaps watching, looking to you to see what you do next. Just on that, what are you going to do next? Paul, I think this might be a question for you. David's asked, in fact, got 2 questions from David. And if everyone's all right for time, we're going to go for another 5 minutes, because then we can get through some more questions, and then we can give everybody 60 minutes CPD rather than 45. So if everyone's all right with that, let's go for another 5 minutes. So David wants to know, this one's for you, Paul. Given that, as a direct result of the COVID-19 situation, there are expected to be an increase of staycations. Are there any plans to have any short-term let or Airbnb products in the near future?
It's probably a little bit too early to tell, I think. And I think obviously CV-19 is here and now, isn't it? Who knows what next year will look like when hopefully, vaccine has sort of become a much bigger part of our life and such like. And who knows whether sort of, foreign holidays will be much more the norm in sort of the next calendar year, I guess. For us, it's all about funding. So I think, what we'd need to do is we need to put together a case for our funder to really sort of look at this in a lot of detail. It's not something that we're sort of, spending a lot of time on at the moment. I think we've got sufficient to do sort of with our sort of core proposition. But I wouldn't rule it out in the future. I think it's kind of been a very interesting past 12 months, and who would have thought it's nearly 12 months since all this started. I guess we just need to sort of see how things work out over probably the course of the rest of the next 6 months or so, and then that may then signal any future proposition developments, I guess. But it's not as straightforward as just saying yes, we're going to do it. And there's a lot of risk factors around that are different to sort of more traditional AST lending or AST tenancies. But I wouldn't rule it out.
It's a good point actually, Paul, because I say when you're looking at trends, is it something that's a flash in the pan? So like last year, maybe this year, people holidaying if they can in the UK because they can't go anywhere else, or is this something that people, is this a shift change and a more long-standing trend? And of course, it's waiting to see, isn't it? So I think one more question, David, this one's for you, Andy, wants to know, can you lend on a new build block of flats, a single leasehold unit in a block of 14, the building is timber framed with single brick outer skin?
Yes. So if it's timber frame with a brick skin, then we can consider that, absolutely. Yeah, it's within policy.
Brilliant.
Coming back to that leasehold freehold relationship thing.
Yeah.
If we can get past that bit, but yes, in terms of the construction type, that's within policy.
Oh, David's giving us a little smiley face. Thank you, David. That's hopefully that helped you.
Made somebody happy today.
Yeah, definitely. I think you'll have made a lot of people happy on this session, to be fair, Andy, because your knowledge is absolutely incredible, and it's just a pleasure to do these with you, because we get through so much on the sessions, and I know you know, brokers have got so many questions, and they're varied, aren't they? They're so wide and varied, and it's absolutely brilliant to have that. So thank you very much, very much for today. If anybody has got any more questions, obviously, Andy, you'd be happy to speak to any brokers after this session.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, pass my details far and wide.
We will. Telephone number is, yeah, absolutely. We'll give them all out there, Andy, so you can be contacted wherever you may be.
Indeed.
But no, thank you very much for that, and Paul as well. Your insight has been invaluable, and that example that you gave as well at the beginning, that was really good, and I think brokers will have got a lot from that.
It's our pleasure, and thanks for this, Nicola. It's our pleasure. And you know, we do have a broad business, and we're keen to add value, you know, as much as we can from some of the businesses and the insights that we've got. And yeah, it's been good.
Well, obviously, Zephyr update all of their criteria on Knowledge Bank, so you can take a look on there. They've got an excellent website with so many good resources as well. So if you haven't been on Zephyr's website, I would definitely say go on there and have a look, because there is some great resource on there to have a little look at. And as I say, any questions that we didn't get around to, we will pass them across to Zephyr so they can pick them up directly. And when we send your CPD certificates out as well, we'll also put Zephyr's contact details for the BDMs for your area as well. So you've got a direct contact. So if you want to pick up with them later on, you can do. So Paul and Andy, thank you so much. It's just an absolute pleasure. I love this session, and thank you again for joining us, and to everybody, and have a good rest of your week. We'll speak to you soon.
And you, thanks for having us. Yeah,
thank you.
Cheers.
Thanks.
Bye everybody.
Bye.